All right, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are joining us from the East and maybe very early evening, or rather, those joining us from the West, good morning, and any joining us from the East, an early good evening. We welcome you to this session, which is a webinar, the first of several webinars we will be hosting on designing linear infrastructure for sustainable outcomes in Africa. And we just want to give you a quick introduction of those who are going to be on the panel with you, but more importantly, the different partners that have pulled together this webinar. This is an effort of several institutions, both in Africa and in North America, and really motivated by work we have all been doing in trying to understand how, as countries and as continents, we can have sustainable approaches in how infrastructure is developed to ensure that the outcomes are beneficial, not only for the economic aspirations, but also from an environmental and social perspectives. And the partners on this panel who have are co-hosting this show, just in brief, we have the Grevy Zebra Trust and Ewaso Lions, which is a partnership in conservation in northern Kenya. And they manage biodiversity and infrastructure programs with the goal of mainstreaming biodiversity into infrastructure decision-making. And they've had specific work going on in Lapset, the Lapset corridor. We also have, as part of this partnership, the Endangered Wildlife Trust, which is based in South Africa. It's a 45-year-old conservation organization and has pioneered partnerships with private sector industry and has worked on applied solutions to mitigate the impact of linear infrastructure on wildlife, looking at aspects of energy and also transport. Another partner from Africa is the African Conservation Center, which is a Kenyan NGO working in East Africa and beyond, and looking at collaborative application of scientific and indigenous knowledge that focuses on improving livelihoods, improving governance, and developing African capacity in African local institutions. Two other partners that are important to us are Power Africa, which is a US government-led partnership coordinated under USAID that brings together various collective resources from 170 public and private sector partners to enable the access of electricity into sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, but definitely not least, we have the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, who are based in the US, and they're focused on reversing the fragmentation of the Earth's landscape and restoring nature's resilience to climate change. They have a corridor and crossings program that uses spatial models to help planners identify how and where animals move across landscapes and to develop practical mitigation solutions. And they are also the secretary to the IUCN Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. As you may know, IUCN has various specialist groups, and they're one of the ones, they are heading the one on conservation connectivity. So these partners are very proud to host this series of webinars, and our first webinar is today, and we welcome all of you. We have over 95 people registered from different parts of the world, and we are looking forward to learning and exchanging both from the panelists and with each other. And to moderate our session for us and to introduce our guests and panelists, I'll hand over to Sarah Childs. Sorry, I might have forgotten to give you my name. My name is Lucy Warenge from the African Conservation Center. And over to you, Sarah, to kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucy. So I now have the privilege of introducing our two speakers for this first webinar in the series. And we have Kim Bonine with us, who is the Program and Training Director from the Conservation Strategy Fund, and Thaís Vilela, who is the Senior Economist for the Conservation Strategy Fund. I would like to mention that this is the first presentation from the African Economy and Environment Network, and Kim will mention a little bit more about this shortly. But this is a partnership between the Conservation Strategy Fund and the Namibia Nature Foundation to set up a platform or hub for professionals to think about mainstreaming biodiversity into decision-making through an economics lens. So thank you very much for joining us. I would just like to give a brief overview of Kim Bonine and her background and Thaís Vilela. So Kim leads CSF's Economics for Environmental Leadership training program, which has activities in over 40 countries and 5 continents. Over the past 15 years, she has led the design and implementation of environmental economics courses and analysis projects in Africa, Asia, and North and South America on themes as diverse as wildlife conservation, infrastructure development, fisheries management, tourism economics, and sustainable development scenarios. She has teaching expertise in areas such as natural resource economics, environmental evaluation, cost-benefit analysis, and strategic communications. Since 2001, Kim has led CSF's flagship 2-week international course delivered in partnership with Stanford University and UC Berkeley. And Kim will give you a few more details on this now online course happening in 2 weeks' time. Prior to joining CSF, Kim worked at Stanford Center for Environmental Science and Policy, conducting ecological and economic fieldwork in the mangrove forests of Micronesia. Her work has appeared in journals such as Ambio, Conservation Biology, and Pacific Science. So welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thaís is an applied economist with a focus on energy and environment. In her work, Thaís evaluates government policies using broad measures of economic, social, and environmental costs and benefits. She has written reports on infrastructure projects such as dams and roads, and I'll point out here that Thaís was one of the co-authors of a local economic cost study of the Crocodile Jaws Dam in northern Kenya. She's also focused on protected areas, the design of marketplaces for environmental reserve quotas, energy planning, and fuel markets. Her work with CSF has been published in various journals such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Nature Communications. Before joining CSF in 2015, Thaís was a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and worked at the consulting firm Ingenio and the think tank Grupo de Economía de Energía. So welcome, Thaís and Kim, and thank you very much for presenting to us today. So Kim, I'll turn this over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I will go ahead. Shall I go ahead and share my screen? Let's see. Here. Great. Okay. So it's terrific to be here. Thanks so much for inviting us to present in this inaugural webinar. I think this partnership that's been developed around linear infrastructure is a really wonderful and innovative way to create this dialogue and conversation. So we're really happy to be a part of it in some way to kick off this webinar series. And as Sarah mentioned, we are launching a new initiative in Africa that is very much inspired by the many alumni from our courses we have in Africa and the different partners and collaborators we've had. And I was thrilled to see quite a number of alumni signed up for this webinar. So hello to all of you. We are hoping to create opportunities for collaboration and capacity building and analysis related to economics and environment, and find more ways to do the sorts of training we've been able to do all over the world, as well as in Africa, create a platform for exchange and collaboration among different professionals, economists in Africa. So it's something that I look forward to talking with hopefully a number of you on this call here to help us think about how we move forward and some of the activities and network that we're developing. So let me go here. One of the first things that we're doing as part of the network is offering a scholarship to one lucky attendant on this webinar to attend our upcoming course here. Let me just get this out of the way. There we go. So we have a 2-week economics and finance for environmental leadership course that we've done in-person courses all over the world, a number in Africa. We have an annual international course that we typically do in California, and this year because of the pandemic, we are transforming it into an online and virtual version. And the silver lining in that is it's enabled us to bring in more people from more places to participate. And that is starting on July 13th. And so we are offering an opportunity for someone on this call to participate in that course coming up. Okay, so what I am going to share with all of you this morning is an example of a project that we did a few years ago in Uganda. And then I'm going to be turning it over to Thaís to discuss a project that she worked on that's at a larger kind of regional multi-country scale. And this first example I'm going to share with you, there's a few different levels that I think are important in terms of not only the analysis itself and the project, but also the processes that were involved of how the project came about and how the project progressed and the different, I think, conversations and consultations that happened that were very important. And as Lucy mentioned in her introduction, we're all aware of the critical importance of road infrastructure, of transportation infrastructure for development. And we're also aware of the many impacts that roads can have on habitats, on the environment, but also on communities. And particularly roads going into wilderness areas can often bring a lot of unwanted change, illegal activity, logging, mining, and can often end up resulting in a loss of well-being for local communities. So it's very important to try to identify and look closely at all the various trade-offs in the planning stages, not at kind of the end of that planning process, only in the kind of safeguards and mitigation stage. So these examples that we're sharing are ones that hopefully offer an opportunity for different frameworks and different ways to think about the planning stages and how to create the best road network that is going to create the most benefits for society as a whole. This study that I'm going to share is about a road that goes through Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda. And the question we were evaluating was whether or not that road should be paved. And this was a project in partnership with the International Gorilla Conservation Program as part of a larger USAID funded program of building infrastructure understanding in landscape development. So I want to acknowledge the IGCP program, as well as we worked with the National Environmental Management Authority in Uganda, as well as the Uganda Wildlife Authority, as well as the USAID BUILD program. So the context of this project is that in 2012, the Uganda National Road Authority expressed interest in developing and improving the road network in the country. And so there were a number of different roads being considered. And the one in particular that we focused on is a road, the Akumba Ruhija Road, that would go, part of it would go through Bwindi National Park. And so I wanted to emphasize the goals of the road, because that's something that became very important as we started to look at the road and analyze the road. The goals were to improve the performance of the tourism sector, improve access, reduce transport costs, improve access to development, and importantly, try to ensure that none of the roadside communities were worse off. So all of these were the stated goals of the various roads that were being proposed throughout Uganda. I want to circle back to how this project came about, because I think the process is very important, and that speaks to why we're trying to create this network and create these links between capacity building and training and analysis and development. So as part of the BUILD program, we held a training course in Southwest Uganda in 2012. And one of our participants, Stephen Asuma in this picture, and there's actually, I think, a couple of alumni from the course on this call, he was with the International Gorilla Conservation Program. And after the course, we invited proposals from various participants for ideas for how they might want to take their some of their new knowledge and tools and perspective and apply it to something they were already working on. And so Stephen and his colleagues at IGCP, they were really concerned about this proposed road through Bwindi. They were concerned about the impacts it might have on the gorillas, on other aspects of the park, on tourism. And so he reached out to us and asked us to help do an analysis of the road. And so this project never would have came about if it weren't for that combination of Stephen having come to this training, having been exposed to some new ideas and new ways to think about the work that he was doing. So as some of you may know, Bwindi is one of the last remaining habitats for almost half of the world's population of critically endangered mountain gorillas. So it's very important in terms of its role in providing habitat for these amazing animals. Here is a map of Bwindi Impenetrable National Park. So it might, hopefully you all can see, I think I can show my cursor. Okay, good. So the red line here is the boundary of the park. And the park is to the left in here, in this line. This is in the southwest part of Uganda here. And the proposed road is this line in black. So the road exists, but it's a dirt road. It's kind of a rough road for tourists to go on. And so the proposal would be to pave this section in here. This next slide shows the road again. You can see the black line going through. This is in green, is essentially the park. And overlaid here in these areas with sort of the cross hatches and marks are the home ranges of various gorilla groups. And as you can see, the home ranges are quite close to where the road is and where the proposed paving is. In addition, there's a number of unhabituated gorilla groups that were in that area, and a group that was, I think, close to being habituated and sort of ready for tourism was also, in this vicinity and close to the road. So there's definitely concern about the proximity of the gorilla groups and the impacts of the paving of the road. The other thing I want to show you on this map, if you can see, there are also some lines here in red. There's this line here, and then in yellow. So one of the things that we did is we first asked, are there any alternative routes that we could look at that would still fulfill the goals, the stated goals of the road? And so there's several routes we looked at that were alternatives. One of these in red, and then in yellow, and then there's another section, potential section here. So just so that you're mindful when I talk about the results, when I talk about the alternatives, these are the alternatives we're talking about. And in these areas where the alternative routes were considered, you have quite a few communities living there, and most of this area has already been deforested. So what did we do to try and answer this question of, is this road a good idea? Or is there a better alternative? So we looked at three different things. we did a cost-benefit analysis of the road, and we used a model called the Road Economic Decision Model. And this is kind of the standard model used by the World Bank or others when they're trying to evaluate what are the benefits of a road or a road improvement project and what are the various costs. And these tend to be associated directly with the road, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And Thaís will also be referencing the same model in her presentation. We also looked at the direct market value of tourism. So we didn't have data to do an in-depth valuation study, and we also decided that that actually wouldn't be as useful as trying to look at what are the current contributions from tourism and how those might be affected. And then we also wanted to look at the number of people served by the road, since that was a primary goal of building these roads for the Ugandan government, was trying to serve more people, more communities. We looked at that question as well. So I will go over some of the results and the process. So one of the very important pieces of this analysis and of this project was consultation from the beginning with communities, with tourists, and also with regional and national government. So we had some very productive and positive conversations with the Uganda National Roads Authority to discuss alternatives, and they were very interested in the project and in talking with us. I think that was very important to do that right from the beginning. Also, consultation and interviews with local communities to find out their concerns, to find out how they were currently benefiting from being in the vicinity of the park, how a road might benefit them, what their concerns are. And then at the same time, we were also collaborating and working at a national level with the National Environmental Management Authority and Uganda Wildlife Authority. And another really important group in all of this was the Uganda Poverty and Conservation Learning Group. And they were great collaborators with us, particularly at the end with dissemination and really reaching out into the communities and sharing the information that we had put together. In terms of the analysis, we started with what I would term as a fairly conservative analysis, to just look at the type of analysis done for almost every road to say, is this a good idea or not a good idea? So the benefits are typically the vehicle operating costs, so saved costs, time, so the saved time that you have traveling, as well as improvements in safety. So those are three of the primary benefits that are put into this model. And then in terms of cost, typically the costs included are construction costs, maintenance costs, and any required compensation for land acquisition. So as you can see from this, it's fairly narrow in terms of what this is looking at. This isn't looking at larger social costs or environmental costs. It's just looking at the benefits and costs from improving a road. And the assumption is that if you're going to move forward with the road, the benefits of this should be greater than the costs. And then you want to think about perhaps other external benefits or costs that might need to be taken into account. So what was interesting in this example is when we looked at the benefits and costs, and typically when you do a cost-benefit analysis, you're looking out at a time horizon of a number of years. So we looked out of a time horizon of 20 years, and we said over that time period, what are the anticipated benefits? What are the investment costs and maintenance costs of these various alternatives? So what we found is that the overall net benefits over that time period were actually negative for all of the roads. That doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad idea. It just tells you how much it will cost the government to do that type of project. So we found that the road through the park was the least costly, at about negative $14 million net benefits. And the alternatives were slightly more costly, about 3 million to 5 million more for those alternative roads that I showed you in that map, partly because I think they were a bit longer to build. What's interesting is we also looked at the people served, and the road through the park served fewer people. The alternatives would actually serve more people, quite a bit, significantly higher number of people. And if there's an added segment of some additional paving, that would serve 25,000 people total. So almost double the number of people through the park for an added cost of $3 to $5 million. So this started to point us towards thinking that these alternatives might be something that should really be considered, because they would serve a lot more people for a modest cost. But the other piece that was really important to consider is, well, what will happen with tourism? The thinking behind this road is that the road will actually benefit tourism, that Uganda needs to pave the road because it will improve tourism and it will bring in more tourism dollars, and that will help offset the costs of the road. Well, when we looked at this and we did our analysis, we found that the opposite seems to be the case. So the logic model is this, that paving the road through Bwindi will result in more traffic and higher speeds. And from all of the work done by people who, the biologists, the park managers, anyone working with gorillas, is that they might move away, they might be hit, that it imposes a potential risk on the gorillas. If the gorillas move, and if the groups that are close to being habituated aren't habituated, what you end up with is fewer gorillas for tourists to see. And then you have a reduced capacity for visitation, which actually results in reduced income and revenue from tourism. So paving the road puts at risk the gorillas as well as the revenue. So we looked at that revenue side, and we looked at what would the difference be if you invested in the road through Bwindi, or if you invested in some of the alternatives around Bwindi. So I think that the key factor in all of this is that the road is not the limiting factor in tourism growth, but the limiting factor is the number of gorillas. So at the time of the study, visitation in Bwindi was already growing at 17% a year. And it was limited not by the road, but by the number of gorillas and the number of permits that were allowed based on keeping the right ratio of tourists to gorillas. And we calculated the potential losses due to a change in gorilla behavior. And again, we tried to be really conservative here, and we assumed over that 20-year period that there was just one gorilla group that might not become habituated because of the road. So we tried to make this realistic as possible, and it could be much more. But just with that change, over that time period, that would result in a loss of almost $16 million just in straight permit revenue, because you wouldn't have those tourists seeing those gorillas. And when you look at the economic multipliers, when you look at the regional economy, that would be a loss of almost 26.5 million for the regional economy. And then when you look at the multipliers for the country as a whole, that's putting at risk 214 million. So when we look back at the additional investment cost of those alternatives, if you remember, that was something like $3 to $5 million more to invest in those alternatives, but you would avoid risking all of this tourism revenue. So our conclusions were that the potential costs of the road through Bwindi were greater than the benefits. And again, we were looking just quite narrowly. There are a lot of other costs you could consider. So the benefits in terms of public services and user benefits didn't outweigh the potential losses in tourism revenue, the investment in maintenance cost, as well as other environmental impacts that we didn't even try to quantify or value. So the conclusions of this study that we shared, and again, it's the process here that was so important, and the dialogue and conversations that happened with many different organizations and institutions, is that if there is an investment that is interested in increasing tourism, if thinking about livelihoods and economic development for communities, the tourism investment should really focus on the protection of the current gorilla population and the potential to grow the gorilla population, really focusing on their habitat and their health. And that the road alternatives outside of Bwindi should be further explored, because for a minimal cost increase, you have a lower risk to the gorillas, a lower risk to the tourism, and greater local benefit in terms of reaching many more people and more communities. So this study, we have a short policy brief as well as the full study, and we're happy to make that available to anyone who's interested in learning more about the work and what we did. And I'll just mention a few considerations that link to the presentation that Thaís is going to give, is that, you know, all road projects generate environmental impacts. And so the question is trying to ask, are they worth it? And there are cases, and surprisingly, there are, especially when thinking about roads in wilderness areas, for example, there's often a win-win situation when you're looking at roads that just might not make sense. And to think about the transportation goals, what are the goals of that road, and is there a better way to meet those goals? And that there's situations where you might have roads with a high economic efficiency, meaning a lot of economic return, and lower impact, and to focus on those roads. And also the importance, through this study and through what Thaís is going to share, the importance of doing this type of analysis and gathering this type of information and having these conversations to inform better regional planning and decision-making in relation to roads, and trying to decide what is really going to contribute most to our well-being and our society. So thank you all so much for listening, and I'm going to pass the baton here to Thaís so she can share an example of an analysis done in a different region in the Amazon of South America, but a framework that I think you all will see that could be really helpful and valuable in thinking about road development and road networks in Africa.
And just before we hand over to Thaís, I just wanted to say that for those with questions, please do pop those into the chat box, and we'll return to those at the end when we have a question and answer session. Thanks. Thanks, Thaís.
Thanks, Kim.
Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Let me share my screen. Share. Okay. Okay, so as Kim mentioned, I'll talk about a study that CSF conducted in 2018 about a possible framework to help decision makers to make wiser choices regarding road projects. When doing this study, we accounted only for road projects in the Amazon region, but we believe that the framework used here might be used in other places, including places in Africa. This study was done in collaboration with our partners in Colombia, FCDS, and in Brazil, IPA, and we had the financial support of the Moore Foundation. The outline for this presentation is the following. I will start by talking a little bit about the background and the reasons why we decided to focus our analysis on a set of road projects instead of an individual project, which is what is usually done. Then I'll go over the methodological part. And the idea here is to show you all the steps that we took to create our efficiency measure, which is the measure that we developed to evaluate the road, excuse me, evaluate the road projects in our sample. And then I'll present the main findings of our paper. And to conclude, I'll summarize the main insights or recommendations. So this study focused on a set of road investments planned for the Amazon basin. The idea is to provide decision makers a big picture about what would happen if all the road projects were implemented, and also inform them about an alternative approach that could help them select which road projects make more sense based on a set of criteria that I will discuss here later. We have several assumptions throughout the paper, but I would say that we start this project under the assumption that roads will continue to be built and improved in the Amazon basin in the next years. Our study considers road projects in 5 countries in the Amazon region: Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. In total, we analyzed 75 road projects totaling more than 12,000 kilometers and $27 billion in investments. So the question is, how have we selected all these 75 road projects? The first criteria was national priorities. To identify these projects, we reviewed official documents and talked to people working on road agencies and departments in each one of the 5 countries. Then from this group of projects, we excluded all the ones that were not located in the Amazon region. And to define this, we used the limit defined by HISC. And then we used data availability as our last criterion. So we removed from our sample most road projects without information on, for example, initial investment. And in fact, we could say that the main challenge that we encountered during this analysis was related to data, especially remote places in the Amazon region. It was hard for us to find data on quality of roads, for example, and traffic. And because of this, we had to do some additional analysis that we were not expecting to do initially. But the main point here is that this information gap does not only pose a challenge to us, but it also poses additional challenges to decision makers that do not have the necessary information to identify and prioritize road projects that would be better for the economy and society. And because of these, decisions are made based on political priorities. And as a result of this situation, we noted that the selection of some road projects being poorly made. For example, we find that many roads in our sample are not economically feasible. Few road projects present a social and environmental impact assessment and mitigation policies. So the potential negative effects are usually greater than they need to be. And because of this poor selection, there is a misuse of public resources. Most road projects in the Amazon region are at least partially funded by national governments. So to avoid this kind of problems, or at least reduce them, we propose an analytical framework that might help governments and societies make better decisions. And we believe that the first step to making better decisions is to have the big picture. And for this, it's important to consider a set of road investments as opposed to evaluating individual projects. We propose a multi-criteria approach that integrates environmental, social, and economic aspects into a single index. In this study, we suggest that the index be the ratio between the economic return and the social environmental damage, because we have a measure of performance benefit in the numerator and a cost in the denominator, we are calling this indicator efficiency measure. And the unit here is dollars per damage. So now I will detail how the efficiency measure was created. And for this, I'll talk about each indicator individually. First, the environmental impact. We divide this into two steps. First, we calculate the deforestation that would be caused if all road projects were implemented. Second, we calculate the ecological importance of the area that would be cleared. So to calculate deforestation caused by road projects, we create two scenarios. The first scenario here, we assume that, the first scenario is business as usual. So we predict deforestation based on the current road network, and we assume that nothing will change. In the second scenario, we include all road projects and recalculate the deforestation. We assume that the only difference between both scenarios is the introduction of these road projects. So the difference between deforestation in scenario 1 and scenario 2 is the additional deforestation caused by the implementation of all 75 road projects. To predict deforestation, we use a software named Dinamica Ego. This software has been used by many research institutes and academics. And what it does is to predict land use change, in our case, a transition from forest to non-forest, based on historical trends in a set of explanatory variables such as the ones I'm showing here. And although we are using Dinamica to predict deforestation in the Amazon, it can be used to predict deforestation in other regions or biomes, such as the savanna biome, for example. For the second step in our environmental damage indicator, we consider 5 elements of ecological importance: national protected areas, species diversity, ecosystems, carbon storage, and water surface. To calculate the ecological importance of the area that would be cleared if all projects were implemented, we overlaid the map containing the additional deforestation on each one of these 5 maps. And as a result, for each one of these elements, we get a measure of environmental risk. So the environmental damage is created by first normalizing the results obtained for each one of the 5 ecological importance elements. And then we combine it then through a simple linear combination, assuming equal weight to each variable. For the social impact, we consider some benefits and potential negative effects. For assessing the benefits, we identified all municipalities through which the road would pass and added all the population living in these municipalities. And we calculated the number of schools and health centers inside a 20-kilometer buffer around each road project. We also took the average distance between schools and health centers and the road project. For the negative impact, we combined the spatial and survey data. First, we identify the road projects that would go over territories of indigenous people, involuntary isolation. And for these projects, we calculate the length of roads that would pass through these territories. We also asked some experts about the level of rejection. so if they knew about society involvement and if there were evidence of any kind of opposition to the project, and if so, what would be the level of opposition, for example, high, medium, or low. We also asked them if they knew if the project is violated or would violate some legal norm, and if so, we asked them to specify whenever possible. To create the net social benefit indicator, we followed the same procedure as before. We normalized each one of the 8 variables considered here, and then combine them linearly, assigning equal weights to each one of the variables. For the economic part, we also consider the potential positive and negative impacts. The benefits are calculating following a consumer surplus approach. Briefly, it considers that the improvement or construction of a new road will reduce transport costs, so it will move from cost 1 to cost 2. And because of this cost reduction, people already using this road will have a direct benefit, and this is captured by this gray area. And given the lower cost, there will be more people using this road, so we have this generated traffic captured by the area of this triangle. So Kim mentioned a little bit about the RED model. In this study, we also used the roads economic decision model. We tried a different approach initially, but decided to use the RED model because most people working on road agencies and road departments are very familiar with this model. So to calculate the net benefit for a project, the RED compares 2 scenarios. One in which the project is not implemented, and another in which the project is implemented. So in a sense, it is similar to the deforestation model, but here the analysis is done project by project instead of all projects at the same time. For improvement projects, the analysis is pretty straightforward. We compare the current situation in terms of transport costs and time costs, as Kim mentioned, to the new situation characterized by the improvement of the road. For the new road project, we had an additional challenge. We were not able to identify alternative routes. So what we did was to assume a hypothetical road in the same location, but in the worst possible condition. A key variable that the RED model uses is traffic. Getting information on this variable was extremely difficult. So what we did here to overcome this problem was to estimate our own traffic data. We used data for the main roads in the Amazon basin, and then using a predictive approach, in this case, we use a simple ordinary square regression. We estimated traffic for each road project in our sample. So here's the analytical framework that we propose in this study. First, we propose decision makers to analyze the economic return for each road project. Then, in the cases where the economic return is negative, here we suggest reevaluating these projects and taking them out of the priority list. It doesn't make sense to invest in projects that would generate economic loss and social environmental damage. And for projects with positive economic return, we recommend decision makers to analyze carefully the existing trade-offs between the economic return and the social environmental damage. For these cases, we suggest using the efficiency measure to identify the best in relative terms projects in this subset. Then for the projects selected, an in-depth project evaluation should be conducted. So I'll show you now the results. I'll follow the same order as before. First, I'll present the results related to the environmental impact, then our findings on the net social benefit and economic return, and finally the results combining these three indicators. So about the environmental damage, we find that all roads will generate a negative impact on the environment. If all road projects in our sample are implemented, they would cause deforestation of at least 2.4 million hectares over the next 20 years. Here we have a map of the additional deforestation calculated as the difference between deforestation and scenario with and another scenario without road projects. In yellow, we have deforestation of up to 500 square kilometers. In orange, up to 2,000 square kilometers. And in red, additional deforestation that range from 2,000 to almost 6,000 square kilometers. The most damaging roads in terms of deforestation are in Brazil. Outside Brazil, we have this road here in Colombia, which is called Troncal Piedemonte, and here Pucallpa, Contamana in Peru as the road project that would cause the highest deforestation. However, this scenario are big picture changes as we consider the ecological importance of the area that would be cleared. So we might have, for example, here there's a road in Peru named Iquitos Sanamiriza, which has an additional deforestation of up to 500 square kilometers. But when we overlay all the environmental importance variables on the additional deforestation map, we see that this road is one of the most damaging road projects in our sample. In yellow, we have the least damaged projects in our sample. About the net social benefit, regarding the negative impacts, we find that 70% of the road projects would result, in our sample, would result in legal infractions related, for example, to environmental statutes and consultative process. 4% of the projects would directly cross the territory of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. And in 5% of the road projects, there have been already conflicts over environmental issues and indigenous rights. On the other hand, we find that about 50% of the road projects would improve access to schools and health centers. About the economic return now, there is great variability regarding the economic return. The net present value ranges from a low of 1 billion negative to more than 3 billion positive. And what is more surprising, it was surprising at least to us, is that 45% of the road projects in our sample are not economically feasible. So there is no economic justification for implementing these projects. But if for some reason these projects with negative economic return are implemented, then countries would lose $7.6 billion and 1.1 million hectares would be cleared. So now is what I think is the most interesting part of this study is when we combine these three indicators. So this graphic shows the relationship between the economic return and the social environmental damage. If you move to the right, you have more economic return or larger net present value. And if you move up, you have less social environmental damage. The horizontal line represents the average social environmental damage. So projects above this line are the ones that have below the average social environmental damage. And projects below this line are the ones with above the average social environmental damage. projects to the right of the vertical line are the ones with a positive economic return, and to the left are the projects with a negative economic return. So because of this horizontal vertical lines, we have 4 quadrants. Projects in quadrant B are the worst projects in our sample. They are not economically feasible, and the implementation of these projects would cause high social environmental damage when compared to the average damage. And projects in quadrant C and D are the ones that have positive economic return and should be considered by decision makers. However, how do we know which project should we choose? It is not obvious that a project here is better than a project here. So the choice will depend on how much weight these 2 variables are on the balance between social environmental damage and economic return. For many projects in these 2 quadrants, we have the classic trade-off, for example. To go from here to here, you are sacrificing the environment to obtain a large economic return. So the idea is that to facilitate decisions regarding these subsets of projects, so the projects that have a positive net present value, we suggest decision makers to use the efficiency measure. And by using this measure, you can rank the projects from the most efficient to the least efficient projects. Here we have the cumulative return in the y-axis and the percentage of social environmental damage score in the horizontal axis. The yellow line here is located at 54% of the damage. So if all projects with positive economic return are implemented, they would cause 54% of the total damage. But we find that it is possible to select a subset of projects that would result in 77% of the economic return, causing 10% of the damage. It is worth mentioning here that this point here is illustrative of the message that we want to pass. We are not saying that this is the optimal point. Again, the acceptable balance between the economic return and social environmental damage must be decided by decision makers along with society. And as a next step, we could indeed try to find the optimal point here by maximizing the welfare, but this is not the goal of this study specifically. But we can talk more about this later if you want. We also note that the right to this dashed line increases in the economic return will be followed by great impacts in the social and environmental dimensions. And this is true the flatter this curve becomes. One caveat of this approach is data, or the lack of reliable data, as I mentioned like in the beginning of the presentation. Here, we opt for using official data, for example, on investment costs, but we know that these costs are usually underreported, and because of this, we have some roads that have well above the average net present value, especially like the roads located in Brazil. And these are the projects that are most efficient. So these are the projects located here. The economic return per damage of these projects is very high. So for sure, this is a 1 point for us that can be improved in this study. Okay, so finally, just as a recapitulation of all that I mentioned, this is kind of similar to what Kim mentioned during her conclusions too. We suggest that decision makers consider projects that are economically feasible. And for these projects, they should evaluate not only the economic return, but also the potential social and environmental damages, and carefully consider the trade-offs between these 2 variables before implementing the projects. So yeah, that's it. I'd like to thank you all for attending this webinar, for the opportunity to present this study here. So yeah, let me stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Thaís, for that really rich case study. And yeah, thanks to Kim also for the case study on Uganda. And I think that both case studies are really important for us to learn from as African countries embark on a path towards inclusive green growth. And in particular, I think they highlight the importance of upstream cost-benefit analysis and multi-criteria analysis, and for understanding our assumptions about which projects may or may not take us down that path of inclusive green growth. So thank you so much for those really rich case studies. And we're now going to enter into about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. And I've received some questions already on the chat, but if you have any questions on Thaís's study, I'm not sure if any have come in yet on her study, please do pop those in the chat box. I think to start, we've got a few questions for you, Kim, and in particular questions from Manikuzwe and Lucy about what the outcome of your study was in terms of influencing decision-making in Uganda.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks for the questions. I know I left it kind of a cliffhanger of so what happened? So I can share with you a couple of things that were important. So to cut to the chase, as of, I think, mid-2018, the road still had not been paved, but there's still continuing conversation. There's still, some pressure to do that. We have tried to get a recent update on the status, but I think it's still in conversation about what best to do, which is an incredibly positive outcome. So I'll just share that because of the study, it enabled a new kind of conversation and a new dialogue to happen among all the different stakeholders interested. So before this study, it was kind of your classic conservation versus development debate. And you might have had the people trying to save the gorillas and the people trying to develop the economy. And with this study, it gave people the room to talk about, well, what's good development? What's bad development? And because the study was done using the World Bank's model, it was credible, it was defensible, and it was something that everybody could agree on and have a conversation. And I think that really opened the door for the Uganda Roads Authority to sit down with the Environmental Management Authority, with the Uganda Conservation and Learning Group, with the International Gorilla Conservation Program, and have a much more productive conversation about what is the future of development of roads in this region. So I think that, I hope, no matter what ultimately happens with this particular segment, that's improved the process and the dialogue and the conversation happening in Uganda. One of the things we were told is that before, not just this study, but we did a number of different things in Uganda as part of this project, but that conversations were happening that didn't happen before. So I think that's one of the most important outcomes from that. And the other piece I wanted to mention, as of 2018, some of the priority shifted to looking at a road that had to do with Murchison Falls. And so I want to mention that because I know this partnership is really looking at linear infrastructure, and it's not just roads. And so as part of this whole process, we were also working with some folks at Wildlife Conservation Society, looking at oil pipeline development through Murchison Falls and the routing of the pipeline, and developed a framework and methodology that I'm happy to share with any of you on this call to talk about. We worked with some folks at Duke University to talk about and propose how to perhaps reroute the pipeline and to try to go outside the park where possible. And that was important because there was also a road that's then being built as part of that pipeline. And so I think the combination of the study in Bwindi, the studies in Murchison Falls, allowed for the Roads Authority and the Uganda Wildlife Authority and various environmental NGOs to talk about what's the best way to move forward with these developments. So as far as we know, the road through Bwindi has not yet been built. And I think that this project and the conversation, the dialogue played definitely a significant role in that.
Great, thanks so much, Kim. We have a question from Wendy Collinson from EWT, and I think Thaís, I'll hand this question to you. She asks, with regards to the analysis, what methods did you use? And she's asking specifically about whether this is incredibly specialized work to do and the kind of skill set that is lacking in many conservationists, and what sort of specialists were in the teams in both of these case studies to gather the data and analyze it.
So thanks for the question. So for these studies specifically, we combine like several different methods, but because there's like the multi-criteria, so it has different components. We had in our team economists, GIS specialists, biologists, maybe other specialists, but right now I can't remember. But yes, and if you're interested, it took about like 1 year to develop this study, 1 year and a few months.
Great, thanks Thaís. Kim, would you like to take that question around how specialized this work is and whether or not conservationists lack the basic economic skills to do these kinds of studies, and how we can improve that skill set? Right.
It's a really great question. Thanks for asking that, Wendy. I think there's a couple of levels that are important. I think an exposure to this type of sort of economic perspective, economic tools, economic kind of lens is important and helpful for anyone working in conservation. And that's something that we try to do through our courses, for example. And there may be other opportunities for conservationists to gain those perspectives. And I think that is really important to help people figure out what's the right question to ask. That's really the rocket science is, what's the right question? How do we approach this problem? How do we think about this? So that's something that people on our team did who aren't PhD economists. They figured out, how could we think about this from an economic lens? How can we think about the question? Other people on the team are people very familiar with the communities, familiar with the park, went out with the GIS to take data points all along the road to feed into the model. And then we had someone on our team who is an economist who helped advise the study and do the red roads model. There's training that can be done of how to use the red roads model. So I think that it definitely is important to have someone with some economics training to help advise and guide and help with the analysis. But everyone else on the team are people who had more of a multidisciplinary background, and then together figure out what's the right way to frame the problem, and then what's the type of information we need to put it together. And so it wasn't a super crazy complex analysis, but it was the right analysis, I guess I would say.
Thanks, Kim. One more question for you. We've got a question from Juliet asking whether you calculated the multiplier effect for the cost to the national economy, and if so, how you did that.
That's a great question. And again, we wanted to try and keep our study as credible as possible. So we used the multiplier effects that the World Bank calculated for Uganda during that time in 2012 and 2013. And those, I think the multiplier effects was something over 2 for Uganda. And we looked at data that had been collected about how how long people tended to stay in Uganda, how much they spent per day, and then the multiplier effects that had been calculated. So a lot of this data we used was already published data or data that was considered very, very credible. And so that's how we got the multiplier effect.
Great,
we didn't
thanks.
calculate that ourselves as part of the study. We have for other studies, but not for this one.
Great, thanks. And Thaís, a question from Manikuzwe for you about the parameters that you used in your study. She asks why you have attributed equal parameters to social and environmental issues, and what were the influencing factors for calculating the environmental damage and social impact?
So we decided to use equal weight to the variables in the environmental and social indicator because we didn't want to be biased, anything like this. So, and we didn't have any a priori to say, oh, this indicator should have like a larger weight than this other indicator. So we decided to be not biased at all. So that's why we decided for the same weight. And the second question, what it was, Sarah? Sorry.
The second question was, what were the most influencing factors?
Yeah. Okay, so that is a hard one because for each road project, the influence of the environmental and the social impacts were different. So we did not have any, for example, the biodiversity risk. It was not the most influence, or it was the most influence for one road, but not for another road. So it is difficult to extract and say, oh, this is the most influence variable in the environmental indicator, because we did not find anything like this. It has like a very, it's very well distributed, you know, among the roads. And it depends on the location also.
Yeah, great, thanks Thaís. We've got a question from Nima asking whether the report is published and is it accessible to everyone. And perhaps while you answer that, it might be quite nice to circle back to that original question to Kim about what's happened since you published this report and what are the outcomes so far.
Yeah, so this study was actually published at PNS, so you can find it online, or I can send you the link. I can put the link here on the chat. And what we are doing now, we are doing a lot of webinars also, to share this study and the results. We have presented these results in Brazil and the other countries in South America. We are trying to talk to decision makers. We have been talking to, for example, senators in Brazil. So we are trying to get them to know at least the framework, you know. So, but we are still talking to them.
Great, thanks, Thaís. And so just because of time, I think we'll end the question and answer session here. But we now have a really exciting segment where we're going to announce the winner of the place at CSF's training course coming up on the 15th of July. So Lucy, would you like to draw a name out of the online hat?
All right, thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Kim and Thaís, for what's definitely a very robust case studies that are very relevant to our context in our various countries. And I can imagine you'll have more and more people connecting with you, trying to see how we can apply this methodology. But one way all these participants can participate is to attend your training program. And so Thaís and Kim run a training program under the Conservation Strategy Fund. It's called Numbers for Nature, Economics and Finance for Environmental Leadership. And it really speaks to what someone asked, what skill sets do we need? How do we start embedding some of these economic models and analysis into how we look at environmental impacts and benefits? So they are offering one course free to a participant in this meeting. The course will run for 2 weeks from July 13th to 24th. The tuition is valued at $1,000. And the criteria is that it has to be someone present. So what Melissa has done out of all those who registered For the webinar, the computer assigned random numbers and came up with a list of top 10. And out of those top 10, we take the first highest number of someone who's present. As I said at the beginning, we had about over 90 registrations, but I think at the highest peak today, we've probably had 38 or 39 participants. So some registered and didn't come. But those who showed up then made it through that balloting prioritization. And the name we have then of the random first highest number on the list on the random number assignment is Mohammed Said from University of Nairobi, an associate of University of Nairobi from Kenya. Congratulations, Mohammed. You have won yourself a 2-week training. So clear up your diary, and I'm sure the Conservation Strategy Fund will be in touch to tell you how to connect through on this. Thank you very much and congratulations.
Congratulations, Mohammed. We look forward to having you in the course.
And so I guess we bring the meeting to a close. Is there anything else, Sarah or Melissa?
No, I don't think so. I think that was the last segment.
Okay, I think there have been requests for the work that the two have done, and I think I see on the chat there is links to the Bwindi policy brief and the Bwindi full study. I believe also Thaís was going to send a link on the work you've done in the Amazon.
Yeah, I included the link, yes. It's there.
Great. So everyone can look at their chat and make sure you grab that link before we close down. And let's read the studies, and we hope to see you again. And everyone else, we hope to continue with this webinar series, and we will be in touch. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day in the Americas and a nice evening on this part of the world. Kwaheri.